With the Army now firmly holding on to Montreal in the fall of 1775, Benedict Arnold was leading an expedition from Fort Western Maine to join the forces already in Canada and to attack Quebec. So what challenges did Arnold's expedition face? What happened during the battle and siege of Quebec? And what was the impact of the Canadian campaign on the American cause? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the Battle of Quebec, from Benedict Arnold's expedition through the retreat to Fort Ticonderoga during the first year of the American Revolution. And joining me for this discussion is Army Historian Steve Elliott. Welcome back, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. We had a great session on the first half of the Canadian campaign, and I'm really excited, looking forward to finding out what else happened. But before we get into that, just want to introduce Steve to the audience. So Steve is or has taught history at Rutgers University. He has served as editor of the Journal New Jersey Studies, and worked as a CMH historian now since 2020. He holds a PhD in history from Temple University and is the author of Surviving the Winters, Housing Washington's Army During the Revolution, which was awarded the 2023 Harry M. Ward Book Prize. And he's also authored 2 of the 13 volumes in CMH's Campaigns of the American Revolution series. And again, Steve, tell our listeners, which 2 did you author?
So I wrote the New Jersey Campaign, 1776 to 77. It's the battles of Trenton and Princeton and their aftermath. And then Northern Campaign, 1778 to 81, which covers the war in the North after the Battle of Monmouth.
Great, yeah. And the topics we're talking about now are also covered in another pamphlet called The Canadian Campaign. So all of these pamphlets or monographs are available from our website. Some of them right now, as of recording this and releasing this here in late August, early September. Some of the later ones are not yet available, but by fall, all of these should be available. Fall here of 2025, all of these should be available on our website. So let's get into this discussion. I really enjoyed talking about the first half of this campaign. And I'm hoping you can maybe bring the audience up to date if they didn't hear the last one, or if it's been a while since they listened to it. So previously we talked about the change in strategy in the Revolution, with a focus now on Canada. So could you please just briefly summarize what took place and the initial invasion that succeeded in capturing Montreal in November of 1775?
Sure. So Canada, or really the province of Quebec, which is what we're focusing on, was a British-controlled territory north of the 13 colonies that, for a number of reasons, at the summer of 1775, American leadership thought was ripe for invasion. It was weakly defended. It was a place where there was some support for the American Revolution and a belief that if that support could be sort of stoked, then the Americans might gain a 14th colony, which is what they referred to Canada as, and it would deny the British a base of operations for using against the colonies later. So for all of those reasons, in the summer of 1775, Congress and American military leaders organized 2 expeditions against Canada, one of which we're focusing on here, one of which we covered in the previous episode. So that expedition left from upstate New York, the Fort Ticonderoga, Lake Champlain area under General Richard Montgomery, overcame a stoutly defended British fort at St. John on the Richelieu River, and by November had captured Montreal, one of the two major towns of Quebec, the other being Quebec City, which we'll talk about here. So the Americans had captured a major town that was a communications center and logistics node, had begun to recruit Canadians into the Continental Army, even offered Canadians a seat in the Continental Congress. So on that front, things were looking pretty good, but it would essentially be meaningless unless they could capture Quebec City itself. Quebec City is kind of at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and any maritime relief force, say coming from Great Britain, which was on the way, would have to stop at Quebec City before moving on into the rest of Canada. So capturing that town was really vital for the overall American strategy, and holding it was vital for British strategy. So even though, again, in the previous episode, we talked about American success at Montreal, they were really only halfway there to their end goal.
Right. And you talked about, for the colonials especially, time is of the essence. They've got to get Quebec before the winter thaw.
Yeah. So during the very cold Canadian winter, the waterways freeze solid, and no British ships and reinforcements can really reach these towns. Once the ice melts, it's a different story, and the Americans do not have anywhere near the naval power they would have needed to interdict a British relief force. So for them, it's a matter of capturing these towns as quickly as they can during the winter. And then on top of that, and this will definitely come into play with the campaign outside Quebec, American soldiers serve on short-term enlistments that expire right around New Year's in most cases. So essentially, if they are not successful by the end of December, a lot of their soldiers are going to go home. And that's obviously not what you want in the middle of a campaign either. So definitely establishes some firm timelines that the Americans need to meet if they're going to be successful.
And now, so now moving forward, I guess we're all familiar with the name Benedict Arnold. You know, he's known as the traitor to the colonials. He tried to give West Point to the British, but you know that was in what 1780, and we're right now in the fall of 75. So at the start of the war, it was a different story for Benedict Arnold. He was a dedicated American patriot. So now, can you describe what was his role in developing the plan to invade Canada?
Arnold, as you mentioned, has a very negative reputation for good reason in American military circles. Now, in 1775, he was not necessarily very well known at the start of the war. Unlike a lot of the other figures that we have talked about and we'll talk about later, he did not have extensive experience in the 7 Years' War. Likely had served briefly as a private, but again, compared to folks like Washington or Schuyler or Montgomery, no real leadership experience. But during late 1760s, 1770s, he had become a successful merchant in Connecticut, keen interest in military affairs and the local militia. When the crisis broke out in early 75, he seized the New Haven, Connecticut powder magazine, keep it out of British hands, and then essentially on his own realized that Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York was an important strategic prize and led a company of troops out there to go and try and take it. Along the way, discovered that the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont had the same idea. So quickly had to work out a command arrangement with their leaders, Ethan Allen, and successfully seized the fort, which again was very lightly defended, but certainly a bold stroke. And then after that, he's essentially put on the sidelines. This is a site in New York. So New York officers like Richard Montgomery and Philip Schuyler really come to the forefront of planning the campaign there. So by summer, basically July and August of 75, Arnold is left without a whole lot to do, so he goes back to Massachusetts, where Washington's army is encircling the British in Boston. And it's there that he has a conversation with Washington about opening essentially a second front in the Canadian campaign that would target Quebec through this essentially wilderness route through Maine that we'll talk about in a minute. So, in some ways we see a couple of different aspects of Arnold's personality. He's impetuous. He's bold. He doesn't necessarily get along well with others. He feels slighted quite often. He wants to be the center of attention, all of which, again, are going to be on display in this part of the Canadian campaign.
Right. Yeah. So now, and you talked about this, while Montgomery is leading his forces into Canada from Fort Ticonderoga, Arnold's developing his plan based on coordination with Washington to open that second front. So he gets up to Fort Western, in Maine, in modern day Augusta, Maine, right on the Kennebec River. Yep. And so, can you talk about his plan?
In the previous episode, we'd talked a lot about how the main route from the colonies into Canada had long been the sort of Hudson River, Lake Champlain, Richelieu River route. And if you go back into the 7 Years' War and other colonial conflicts, that had seen multiple campaigns waged in that area. There had long been a theory that you could also send a force through what's now Maine. And back then, Maine was not a colony or a state. It was part of Massachusetts. Very sparsely inhabited by European or American settlers, still very much what we'd consider a wilderness, so very undeveloped. So not the usual place you would send a large army to campaign in colonial times, but as far back as the 1680s, when Canada was still held by the French, French officers had postulated that a network of rivers in Maine, the Kennebec and the Chaudière, could form a corridor that you could move a force over, essentially a highway of invasion. And so this idea had been around for a while. After the 7 Years' War, the British had actually mapped that route. So in 1761, so actually when the war is still going on, officer of the Royal Engineers, John Montresor, goes out into the Maine wilderness and creates a series of maps and charts of this Kennebec-Chaudière route. And, they're on file. So it proves to an extent the viability of this invasion route. Luckily for the Americans, early on in the Revolutionary War, they actually captured copies of these maps. So now they have them to work off of, so a sort of intelligence coup. And, it seems that when Arnold went to visit Washington, this topic came up, and Arnold says, hey, why don't we try this? It will essentially divide British forces. We can attack Montreal and Quebec simultaneously. Again, if we take Quebec, that's really going to seal the whole Canadian campaign for us. And on top of that, I think a underappreciated aspect of Arnold's March and of the Canadian campaign itself is that the Americans had a pretty large force of troops. They had a lot of enthusiasm behind the conflict at this time. You had a popular outpouring of patriotism and people enlisting. But with the British just in Boston, you only needed so many troops to maintain that siege. So what else were you going to do with them? So in a way, this was a useful outlet, right? Was they had spare troops and you needed to employ them somewhere. So let's add them to this Canadian expedition. So with all that being said, Arnold is put in charge of a force of troops detached from Washington's army around Boston and given orders to follow this sort of secret route, the Kennebec route, to attack Quebec from a unexpected direction. So he gathers 13 companies of troops, which were volunteers drawn from the Army of Observation, or the Continental Forces around Boston. They are going to number 1,100 in total. So not a huge force, but as we'll see, pretty large for taking through the Maine wilderness. Divided into 3 battalions. 2 of those are going to be mostly New England troops, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. One of them is going to be made up of riflemen from Virginia and Pennsylvania. So again, we're getting more colonial representation here. Also a handful of St. Francis Indians that are going to serve as guides. Records indicate at least 1 black soldier, and a number of women kind of accompanying the army as camp followers. So again, even a fairly small force of 1,100 as a pretty big cross-section of American society going on.
And did those troops have some of the same challenges that Montgomery's troops had as far as levels of training and rivalries against each other?
To an extent, New England troops tended to have the most well-organized militia systems. So just in terms of regular drill, experienced officers and that sort of thing, probably a bit better off than the New York troops that are in the bulk of Montgomery's forces. But yeah, it's still early in a war. As you said, rivalries, certainly Southern troops like the Virginians might find themselves not necessarily getting along with Pennsylvanians or New England troops. But he didn't really have to sit and train and worry about a lot of those like Montgomery had to worry about. Not as much, and also even if he did, there wasn't much time. They've got quite an excursion in front of them.
What about enlistments running out? Did he have that worry?
That's going to be a big problem, just as it was for Montgomery. It was essentially getting these troops to where they needed to be and winning his battles before the clock ran.
So time is of the essence once again. Okay.
Exactly. Right. So they depart from the Boston area, actually avoid British naval patrols to sail up to the coast of Connecticut along the Kennebec River. They get there in mid-September, avoid, again, British patrols, get up to Fort Western, present-day Augusta, Maine, which they use as a staging area. So they gather their 1,100 troops. They, like Montgomery, have to build boats because, again, all your logistics and a lot of your advance is going to be boat-bound, for lack of a better term. However, unlike Montgomery, who's operating on Lake Champlain and the St. Lawrence River, very large bodies of water, the Kennebec and the Chaudière are really more like streams by comparison. So here the Americans are going to be using what are called bateaux, which are kind of just long, flat-bottomed, essentially like big canoes or rowboats or that sort of thing. So they're not impressive warships or anything like that, but they're have a long history of being used for transportation on these inland waterways. So they build 200 of them out of, again, leaky local green wood in a hasty fashion. So they're not going to be the best boats, but they're what's available. And that's essentially what's going to be used to transport troops. Then they build another 20 of them for supplies. They've got about 100 tons of equipment that needs to be carried with them as well. So all that's being built up at Fort Western.
And it's not all just a straight waterway, is it? They've got to go overland at some point.
Yes, that's a really important point is that particularly on smaller inland waterways like this, they're only navigable even for a bateau for certain stretches. And whenever you hit waterfalls or rapids, you have to take everything out of the boats and do what's called a portage, where you move everything overland till the next stretch of navigable river, which is as time-consuming and as labor-intensive as it sounds. Basically, taking all your stuff out of the water, packing it up, and then moving it overland till you can get to water again. That's kind of the bateau story. They also start gathering intelligence. They start double checking their maps and maybe improving on the maps, because as we'll discover, the Montessor maps did not have a ton of detail on terrain features or elevations. They were really more charting the river's courses. So as we'll discover, the route to Quebec was not nearly as straightforward and easy as they thought it might have been when they planned this expedition in the first place. So that essentially is everything that's going on at Fort Western in September of 1775 as they're getting ready to set off on this expedition.
Yeah, so they leave at the end of September, I believe. Yep. They have that the what's been called now the Great Feast at Fort Western, and they move out. And did the British have any idea that they were going to be coming up? I mean, at this point they knew about Montgomery, and they were already engaging them at St. John's and then later on Montreal. But did they have any knowledge that Arnold was bringing another, 1,100 plus people up?
Yeah, again, this is essentially an undefended route. And one imagines if there had been a British column in Maine that might have ended the whole expedition given the other troubles that they faced. But no, this is essentially, in some ways, proves correct the strategy, because again, they have an unopposed march into the heart of enemy territory, and Arnold will be able to show up outside Quebec with minimal resistance from the enemy. So in that regard, that's something that goes right for this campaign. Is again, they do kind of surprise the enemy by approaching from this direction.
Pure Sun Tzu, right? Go where you're least expected. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so can you describe this expedition? You've alluded to some of the challenges, but what did they face in this expedition? How long did it take?
Right. So they're leaving late September, and it's one of these things where sort of one thing seems to go wrong after another, right? So Arnold divides his force into sort of 4 divisions that will march on consecutive days. So they sort of stagger the departure from Fort Western so as to not overcrowd their route of march. There's an advance party of riflemen led by Captain Daniel Morgan, who will go on to become an important leader in the latter part of the Revolution, with orders to kind of clear out the roads and sort of blaze a path for the rest of the force to follow. But again, they discover that their maps are not quite as accurate as they were hoping, and that the route was much rougher than they might have expected. So just 20 miles upstream, they encounter the Taconic Falls, which are one of the first portages. So again, they have to pull everything out of the river. They hire ox teams from local civilians to pull their bateau, which are 400 pounds. So, that certainly quite an exertion. They have to unload all their supplies just to get around all these falls and then get back into the water. About 80 miles inland or upstream from Fort Augusta, the area that was sparsely settled gives way to an area that's not settled at all. So now they're really in the heart of the American wilderness. There's no civilians to help them out with portages now. There's no ox teams or horse teams that you could hire locally. So everything has to be done by hand by the soldiers and accompanying civilians that are on the march. There's a trail, an area called the Great Carrying Place, another one of these big portages, that takes 5 days to cross 12 miles. You're averaging 2 miles a day or thereabouts. They have to go through 3 ponds, a swamp, and cross 1,000 feet of elevation just in this little 12-mile stretch. All that's in early October to mid-October. On 22 October, they record heavy rains, and some scholars think this might be the remains of an Atlantic hurricane. They figure that's kind of the tail end of hurricane season. So heavy rains that wash away their camp, destroy equipment. I think like 8 to 10 inches come down in the space of a day. So the rivers flood. And then, you're essentially in northern Maine in October, So if it's not the rain, it's the snow. And they actually get 6 inches of snow right after that big rainstorm. So, that's going to create problems in other ways. By the latter part of the march, troops are talking about wading through waist-deep water that's got ice flows in it. Just these winding trails through the wilderness. They, on a good day, are averaging 5 miles per day, when a colonial army at a leisurely pace would usually do about 12 to 15 miles per day. So very slow going. Yeah. The 4th Division, again, remember, Arnold divided his forces into 4. 4th Division actually turns back without orders and says, we're done. No. And they go back to Fort Western. So about 25% of the force is reduced right there. So with the march taking much longer than expected, with supplies washed away by the rain or buried in snow or non-existent from the surrounding population, they start to run into a lot of supply shortages, far more than, say, Montgomery's force encountered. So we see soldiers talking about in their diaries just eating wild game that they can kind of shoot in the woods, the bark off of trees, candles, soap bars, boiling their shoes. This later on becomes kind of standard fare when talking about starving Continentals, but this is really the first time that we see this pop up during the war, and it just speaks to the hardship of this march through the wilderness trying to get to Quebec. So that's, again, the doom and gloom of it. It does have something of a positive ending. By the 30th of October, they had started to move through the wilderness and cross over into the Canadian side, by which they're getting closer to kind of French-speaking settlements in Quebec. So Arnold actually goes out ahead of the column and finds a French settlement, Sartillon, where he hires horse transport and obtains some food for the troops. So that kind of brings to an end of the real starving time. Oh, yeah. But basically...
A few tough weeks there. Yeah.
So they expected the march to last 20 days. And on the original maps they had, it was supposed to be 180 miles. It actually took 6 weeks, so about twice as long. And they had to traverse 270 miles just because of the winding natures of the trails. And again, it's just much further than the maps had shown. They had to undergo 27 portages. So 27 different times they had to pull everything out of the water and haul it across land. Only 650 of the original 1,100 troops completed the ordeal. Unfortunately, we don't know how many died versus how many deserted or were sent home sick. But we know that they lost about half the force in the course of the march. So that essentially becomes one of the first great epic stories of the Revolution. Arnold is hailed as an American Hannibal. For
interesting.
leading his army over the mountains to attack Quebec. The number of diaries that survive from Arnold's expedition is much higher than a lot of other campaigns of the war. So we get a sense that soldiers taking part in it knew they were, embarking on this kind of epic journey, and they recorded their experiences, which is how we know all these details about the portages and starvation and that sort of thing.
These firsthand accounts are just amazing.
So when all is said and done, they do arrive on the lower St. Lawrence by early November. They spend a good week recuperating, as you might imagine, after that ordeal. So they repair their equipment, they stock up on food, nourish soldiers back to health, and are ready to go again in surprisingly quick time. So by the 13th of November, Arnold's troops have arrived at the St. Lawrence River itself. In fact, they take their boats and they cross the river, so onto the Quebec City shore, and during the night kind of scale up the cliffs, and we'll talk a little bit about the geography of Quebec City itself. But essentially, by 13 November, Arnold has his army camped outside the walls of Quebec.
And then how did he link up with Montgomery? And did he even know at that point that Montgomery had taken Montreal?
Arnold's been in the woods for 6 weeks, so essentially out of
no satellite radio.
Exactly. So did not have a great picture of the strategic situation, and I think kind of bringing the army to the walls of Quebec so soon again illustrates that sort of boldness and rashness of Arnold's character. But pretty quickly he realizes he has no cannon, so couldn't bring cannon on the march through the wilderness. So penetrating the walls of Quebec is a non-starter. Still short on supplies, still has those enlistment expirations in the back of his mind. So he attempts to intimidate the British into surrendering, basically parades his troops in front of the walls saying, look how strong my force is, sends a surrender demand, has a soldier shout insults at British troops manning the walls, and the British are not having it. So Arnold actually withdraws up the St. Lawrence, and that's where he encounters Montgomery.
Okay.
So by this point, we're in mid-November. So Americans have just captured Montreal and are proceeding downriver.
What was his goal of withdrawing? Just to regroup?
Yeah. Essentially realizing that the intimidation strategy is not working. So let's head towards Montreal. By this point, he's gotten some word that the other American army is in the area. So they finally link up in mid-November. So you've got Montgomery's command with Arnold's command combined now. So Montgomery, maybe just to remind people, had captured Montreal after marching north from New York. He left 500 troops to garrison that city and then brought about 500 more with him down the river to join with Arnold. So combined, they've got about 1,000 men. Thanks to Montgomery, they also have artillery, about a dozen cannons, as well as some ships to bring supplies down the river. So with that 1,000 men, they returned to Quebec and encircled the city on 4 December of 1775. So that sort of brings us to the preliminary stage of what's going to be the climax of the campaign.
So the plan now is what? Just to lay siege to the city then?
Right.
And hope they give up like they did in Montreal?
Yeah. Problem is Quebec is a very big target, population of 5,000 at the time, so no mere village. This is a legit city by colonial standards. It's a tough position to attack, too. It sits on high bluffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River. There's what's called the Upper Town, so that's the part that's, again, on top of these cliffs and has a very extensive wall and bastion system. Again, this was the center of French power in North America up till 1763. So very strongly defended Upper Town. Then at the bottom of the cliffs, there's what's called the Lower Town. So that's where the docks and the warehouses are. Lower Town was mostly French-speaking. Upper Town is where a lot of the British immigrants had settled after the British conquest. But to sum up, it's difficult geography. It's essentially split in two. There's a very strong wall. It's on top of the bluffs. And the British, who have basically pulled back all their troops from other parts of Canada, have decided to make their stand here. So Guy Carleton, the British commander-in-chief, is there. He's got 1,300 British regulars. Americans only have 1,000. So sure, most of our listeners familiar with military history probably know that attacking force usually likes to have numerical superiority, not be outnumbered by a significant force.
3 to 1 ideally. Yeah.
Exactly.
3 to 1 ideally.
Not necessarily going to have that
No,
here.
no.
Now, evening the odds a bit, is the fact that of that garrison of 1,300, there's very few British regulars. Only about 70 redcoats and 30 Royal Marines from British ships. On top of that, there's about 200 English-speaking and 300 French-speaking militia. And then the rest is just naval personnel from boats that are stuck in the ice in the harbor until spring. So not a particularly large force of trained infantry defending the town. However, they have 155 total pieces of artillery to guard the walls. How many of those were actually mounted and ready to go is unclear, but at least 40 were. So again, the Americans only have 12 cannon. The British have 40 at least, including a 32-pounder. Figure that the average field gun at the time was a 4 to 8 pound artillery piece. So this is a massive gun designed to batter down walls and sink ships. So the Americans are heavily outgunned by the British garrison. So the Americans essentially have a dilemma where they've got a superiority in infantry, but an inferiority in artillery, an overall numerical inferiority. And they really can't wait to starve the enemy out. The British have gathered a large number of supplies in Quebec. So they know that they've got enough food on hand to withstand a siege until March or April. And by that point, the ice is going to melt and British reinforcements are going to show up. Conversely, the Americans know that their soldiers' enlistments are going to expire at the end of the year. So they might not even have an army come springtime. So all of this means that a traditional siege is going to be impossible. They're not going to be able to starve the enemy out. They're not going to be able to bombard them out with artillery. So again, they attempt to innovate. So they resort to intimidation again. They start to seize supplies from the countryside. They start to send spies and subversives into Quebec and spread rumors among the population that encourage people to sort of turn on the British and support the Americans. So a little bit of a civil affairs, psyops kind of thing. And they repeatedly demand surrenders. If you demand enough times, maybe the British will change their minds. They also use more traditional tactics. So they have sharpshooters that are essentially sniping at the British garrison. They keep up an intermittent mortar and gunfire on the enemy. They build siege batteries, so essentially earthworks to mount their guns to get a more effective fire on the walls. But again, they do not have the number of guns, the number of trained engineers to really embark on a more extensive siege works like you'd see in a traditional European siege. And the weather is terrible. Again, this is Quebec in December, so rain and wind and heavy snow is impeding them from doing a lot of construction work you need for a siege. And then British counter battery fire is effective because, again, they've got a lot of artillery. They've got a 32-pounder. So anytime the Americans try to set up a base of fire, the British can essentially blast it. So all these preliminaries indicate that a traditional siege is not going to be a viable strategy. So what do they do instead? They decide to launch an assault on the walls of Quebec. The idea being that...
Who was in command of the overall operation? Was it Montgomery? Was it Arnold? Or how did they...
So Montgomery is in overall command with Arnold kind of serving as his chief lieutenant.
The devil in his ear.
Seemingly they get along decently well, which is rare for Arnold. But again, Montgomery is a very effective commander, and they seem to make it work. So again, two bold, energetic leaders looking at the situation before them, realizing that time's not on their side. Their best hope is, again, they've got a decently sized force of experienced and trained infantry and hopefully a city full of residents that might decide to support them if they can actually get a foothold in the town. So they resolve to launch a direct assault before the new year. Because again, the idea being that when the new year arrives, they're going to lose a lot of their enlistments. So the original plan they come up with is to attack the upper town. So that's the part of the town that's on the bluffs, and that's the really the key to the town. And they had intelligence that it was weakly defended. So they were going to send a sort of a diversionary force of 1/3 of their troops against the lower town, and then use 2/3 of the force to storm the upper town and essentially hit the enemy with everything they have, surprise them, overwhelm the garrison, and hopefully capture the guns and everything before the enemy has a chance to react. Unfortunately, things did not go as planned. Essentially, there's desertion, and somehow or another, a word of the plan gets leaked to the British. So by the time they would have been ready to implement that attack, the British had heavily reinforced the defenses of the upper town. So that is going to be a non-starter by late December. Throughout this entire time, there's difficulties not so much between Arnold and Montgomery, but between Arnold and some of his subordinate commanders. So some of the lower ranking officers are getting restless. Some of the enlisted men did not like the idea of being thrown into an assault days before their enlistments expired. It seemed like they're getting ready to go home.
Because we're at the end of December now.
Yeah, we're coming up on Christmas and the final week of December. So, again, morale's deteriorating as you imagine it might with a tenuously supplied army camped outside the walls of a Canadian city in late December. So things are increasingly looking desperate, but Montgomery again steps forward and makes a direct appeal to his men and says, we've come this far. Why not give it a try before some of you have to go home and things start to look increasingly ugly? So they resolved to launch an attack initially on 27 December. This is when, again, they realized the British have gotten word of the plan and that their upper town defenses have been strengthened. So cancel that, and they decide on a new plan. Now they're going to essentially do a small demonstration against the upper town and send everything they have against the lower town. Now thinking that, again, the British have switched their forces to defend the upper town. Right. Problem with that is again, the lower town is not where the population center is. Yeah. It's dominated by cliffs and heights. So you could essentially be in a very vulnerable position even if you capture the lower town. But the thinking was, at least if we get a foothold, maybe we can exploit that and something will happen. So again, maybe not the best suppositions to base your tactical plan on, essentially get a foothold and hope for the best. Yeah. But in this very difficult situation, that is the best plan that they could come up with. So on the night of 30 to 31 December, so basically coming up on the last day of the year, a blizzard rolls through the area, which is good for the Americans, actually, because it provides some cover for the attack and will maybe lull the enemy into thinking that they're safe. So they're resolved, this is when it's going to happen. They're going to launch their attack. And that becomes the assault on Quebec. So it brings us to the essentially final days of December of 1775. Again, enlistments are going to expire at the new year, so they've staked everything on this. And if kind of the foreshadowing has not made it clear, the assault does not go particularly well for the Americans. So diversion begins at 0400 with some troops making a demonstration against the upper town. This was even just a broad sketch of the plan, not an easy operation to undertake. Some troops have to do a 3-mile approach march just to get to the walls of the city. And that's through the snow. It's been snowing for quite a while now and in the middle of a blizzard. Even to get through the defenses of the lower town, which was not as well defended as the upper town, Montgomery has to lead a column past two 20-foot high palisades, so essentially two 20-foot walls, which they have to either break through or mount using ladders. And they discover that these are backed up by a strong point defended by artillery. So Montgomery's column essentially gets marched right into a blast of grape shot. So essentially like a shotgun shell fired out of a cannon, which instantly kills Montgomery. And losing a beloved commander at the outset of the operation is obviously a huge blow to American morale. So Montgomery's prong of the attack is quickly loses its momentum, as you might imagine. Arnold leads a second column into the lower town. They actually have to march single file over the path approaching, just because it's so narrow and at this point covered in snow and mud and everything else. They have to overcome barricades, artillery fire, and enemy musketry. So just essentially under fire the whole way to get into the lower town. Arnold is wounded during that part of the attack, suffers, I believe, a musket ball to the leg. So he is put out of action pretty early on.
Something that he'll suffer from basically the rest of his life, I believe.
Yeah, and his pension for battlefield injuries continues. He loses a leg at Saratoga a couple of years later. So again, both American commanders leading from the front, trying to inspire their men. But when that happens, you run the risk of becoming a casualty. And again, Arnold is wounded and Montgomery is killed. So tactical command actually falls to Daniel Morgan, who'd been a captain at the start of this. So getting pretty far down the chain of command. And he manages to get his troops into the lower town and occupy some buildings there, where they hold out until the morning, and then realize that this entire plan has not gone well at all, and they are forced to surrender. So that essentially brings the attack.
So they surrender rather than retreat, or
the troops under Morgan's command that had made it into
the ones inside. Okay.
Yeah. So Arnold had actually been evacuated to the rear along with some of the other troops. So it's not like the entire force is taken, but the overall losses paint a pretty ugly picture. So the Americans suffer 48 killed, 34 wounded, 372 captured, and 6 pieces of artillery lost. The British lose 5 dead and 14 wounded.
Oh, wow.
So it's a decisive repulse.
Right. Lopsided victory. Yeah. I guess this basically ends the Quebec campaign.
Again, where things get interesting, I think, from a strategic perspective, is that pretty quickly it's clear that the Americans do not have the artillery, the manpower, the morale at this point to capture Quebec City. Yeah. So they're forced to withdraw back towards Montreal. And some might say that this is when the campaign should have been shut down. But this is, and again, folks that are discussing strategy, I think, can have a lot of lessons to come out of this. Congress and the sort of political authorities in U.S. or what will become the United States decide to reinforce failure. They send more reinforcements up to Canada, essentially throwing good money after bad and rebuilding the Canadian force. So 1,500 new troops show up in Montreal by early March, followed by 6,000 troops from New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey by April. So there's almost 8,000 Continentals in Canada by the spring of 1776. A new general, John Thomas, arrives to replace Montgomery and the wounded Arnold. So there's, in hindsight, it looks like the campaign should have been over after that repulse at Quebec in the end of December. But to American leadership, they're going to try and see this thing through. So again, they rebuild the Canadian Army or the American Army in Canada. They appoint new generals. Arnold actually, after he recovers from his wound, leads 800 troops forward to maintain a blockade of Quebec. Again, it can't even really be called a siege, but they keep some troops outside the walls to keep an eye on it. There's an attempt to, again, bring Canada into the political fold of the 13 colonies by making it a 14th colony. So congressional delegation arrives to discuss matters with Canadian civilian leaders. And there's a sense that this campaign might not be over. That, again, we still hold Montreal, we still hold Trois-Rivières, the British were still held up in Quebec City. So despite the defeat, if you look at the numbers and the territory held, things are still looking pretty good for the Americans. Okay. Yeah. But this is where things start to fall apart. First, the occupation of Canada starts to descend into problems. There's issues with currency and debt and civil authorities. Another American general arrives, David Wooster, who does not get along with the Canadian civilians. So they start to lose the battle for hearts and minds. More pressingly, from a military perspective, is a severe outbreak of smallpox. Oh, no. So smallpox is one of the most deadly diseases in history. It's something that in North America was still regarded as being very deadly and very much a urban disease. So you tend to see it in places like New York and Boston, not so much in the countryside. And what historians think happened is that when the Americans moved into Montreal and briefly into the Quebec area, these American soldiers, many of whom were from rural areas and had never been exposed to the disease, quickly picked it up, as they passed through these cities. And then it just spreads through the ranks like wildfire. Again, you can imagine a crowded, dirty military camp as a good incubating ground for diseases. There were remedies for smallpox, a process known as inoculation. But to have that be effective, it needs to be implemented in a very systemized fashion. And as sort of American leadership starts to fall apart during the spring of 1775, no one was really implementing that on a widespread fashion. So long story short, sickness ravages the American army. By July of 1776, there's probably close to 40% sick rate in the army. In fact, General Thomas, the officer who was appointed to command this force in the spring, is actually a smallpox casualty. He dies of smallpox.
Oh, gosh.
So it is killing generals, it's killing privates, and everybody in between. So essentially, it becomes one of these situations where disease accomplishes what the British couldn't, in essentially inflicting heavy casualties on this American
But did the
force.
British reinforcements arrive at this time also?
They did.
Okay.
So British fleet arrives by May.
Okay.
About 12,000 soldiers
Oh, wow.
reinforce Carleton. So now the strategic momentum quickly swings in the opposite direction.
So with the disease now being outnumbered again by large numbers, what happened with the Americans?
So they quickly pull back from Quebec after Carleton's reinforcements arrive. They actually launch one last attack on Trois-Rivières in June of 76, which, again, is one of these things where intelligence indicates there's an isolated enemy position, and they figure if we can kind of hit that, we can restore morale and kind of regain the momentum of the campaign. Quickly discover that Trois-Rivières is actually heavily defended, and the attack is quickly repulsed. So by the time we get to July, the Americans have abandoned Canada entirely. So they pull out of Montreal, they pull out of Saint-Jean, withdraw all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. They still got about 5,000 troops under arms, which, remember, in early May, that had to be even more.
Yeah.
But again, disease was taking its toll by that point. They're from 16 different regiments from a good number of the colonies by this point, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the New England states, New York, but ravaged by sickness, lacking tents, lacking supplies. So very vulnerable position. So essentially the Canadian campaign collapses very quickly in the face of disease and British reinforcements.
Yeah, so that ends, and the colonials now back at Fort Ticonderoga?
Exactly. So
And
right
they-
back to where they started a year before.
Right, so not even St. John. So they're
Yes.
down in at Fort Ticonderoga.
Yep.
And that's basically where the Canadian campaign ends.
There's going to be a sort of coda to this in the late summer and early fall, where the British now on the offensive decide to make a move down Lake Champlain and maybe towards Fort Ticonderoga, where this is again where the naval side of things comes into play. So both the British under General Carleton and the Americans, where Benedict Arnold is still kind of in field command at this point, both build up substantial fleets of boats on Lake Champlain. And in October, we'll actually have a naval battle. It's known as the Battle of Valcour Island, where we have row galleys and sailing ships mounting dozens of cannons, facing off against one another like a good old-fashioned fighting style naval battle, which winds up being another decisive American defeat. They lose 80 killed, 120 wounded, 2 ships sunk. The rest of Arnold's fleet is essentially burned or scuttled as they withdraw down the lake. But and this is a interesting kind of mirror image of say the St. John fight that started the Canadian campaign. All of that action eats up time, and by the time the Americans have burned their ships and fallen back to Fort Ty, they've been able to rebuild their forces again for what might be the third time in this campaign now. And by that point, it's late October, and General Carleton says, "You know what? I'm going to wait until next year to try another offensive."
And I think that was an issue with Carleton a few times, that he may have had a victory, but he never pursued.
Yeah, a cautious commander, maybe we could say, which is not the worst thing, as we'll see what happens to an aggressive British commander in upstate New York the following year with the Saratoga campaign. But some folks have definitely said that was a missed opportunity for the British. But again, long story short, the Americans hold on in upstate New York. They have an army at Fort Ticonderoga, and they'll be somewhat ready to go to pursue another campaign in that area in the spring of 1777.
And we give up on the 14th colony, I suppose.
Yes. So if we want to move on to maybe just talking about what the overall impact and takeaways from this campaign were. First, we might say, was it worth it to try and go for Canada? And that's a maybe. Again, it was lightly defended. It was a place that had been used as a staging ground for offensives against the colonies in the past. And the Americans had a substantial force and not many other places they could have employed it. So in that way, Canada made sense. Obviously, the execution of that campaign was not everything they could have hoped for. And again, the disease, the impediments in getting their troops into Canada, lack of artillery, stubborn British resistance at St. John, all held up from what could have been a more successful campaign. In the longer term, again, sending more reinforcements to Canada in the spring of 76 might not have been the best decision, especially when we see what happens to American forces elsewhere in the colonies at that time. So maybe not a great use of resources. Was the project of creating a 14th colony ever really viable? Is something that really transcends military history into maybe more of a diplomatic or political or social question. Certainly in the subsequent 250 years of history, Canada has proven to be a very distinct entity from the United States, and despite often being a partner and a friend, is also a place that is fiercely independent and is very protective of that identity as a country that is not the United States. And in fact, future American efforts to invade Canada in the War of 1812 were no more successful than Montgomery and Arnold in 1775. Montgomery himself kind of comes out as one of the first martyrs of the Revolutionary War, and is immortalized in paintings and songs, and is hailed as a hero of the colonial cause. His Irish background gets him a lot of praise in the 19th century. So you see a lot of Irish Americans forming Montgomery Rifles or Montgomery regiments in militia units in the 19th century. So in that regard, the campaign is well remembered. For most folks, though, I don't know how many people, 250 years later, really remember the Canadian campaign, say compared to Bunker Hill or Yorktown or the more famous battles of the Revolution. Yeah. So it's in some ways one of the forgotten periods of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know much about it at all until we started delving more into the Revolutionary War for the 250th commemoration. But so that's great. We need to start wrapping this up. Is there anything else that you want to add?
Again, I think it's just a very interesting campaign for folks that are of a military history bent to look into. And it did not have a positive outcome for the U.S. Army, but I think it has a lot of lessons. So I think in that regard, it's still worth studying.
Yeah, great. And on our website at history.army.mil, you can go there and check out our publications. We have some really good new publications out about this, and also on our Revolutionary War website, which you can find from our main website as well. So, but before we close, it is time for our segment of Huzzah Trivia. So is there some piece of trivia that you can share about this campaign?
So as a organizational and unit historian at CMH, my day job is to kind of keep track of the lineage and honors of our Army units. And Company A, 1st Battalion, 69th Infantry Regiment of the New York National Guard, perpetuates the lineage of a company of the old 1st New York Regiment, which fought at Quebec. Oh, cool. So is one of the only, if not the only, Army units that has a Quebec campaign streamer.
Oh, very cool. Very good. And, that's interesting that you bring up the lineage and honors, because there are only 34 units in the Army today that have direct lineage back to the Revolutionary War, and all but one are National Guard.
Correct.
Yeah. And the one that's active duty?
I believe in the artillery branch.
It was Hamilton's own, and I think it's out at Fort Riley, Kansas. So, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. This was fascinating, and again, talking about a topic that you really don't hear a lot about from the Revolutionary War. So I appreciate all your insights today about Arnold's expedition and the Battle of Quebec. And folks, if you'd like to learn more about the American Revolution, the Battle of Quebec, or learn more about Army history in general, then please explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.